Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about time travel in Star Trek, and more specifically, the new idea that they introduced in season 3 of Star Trek Discovery that time travel might cause health problems if someone jumps too far into the future, especially if it's coupled with moving to a different timeline or a different parallel universe and also jumping through time. Then you might suffer some kind of a breakdown of your atomic structure because, quote, the molecules want to go back closer to the time in which they were created, which I think in real life this is a totally absurd, stupid idea, but in the context of Star Trek, in which we always saw a lot of silly ideas, it strangely kind of fits a few ideas that we heard in other episodes in the old shows, as well as explain away things that didn't happen in the shows, namely that we never really saw time travelers coming from a distant future or a distant past. It was always just a few centuries difference that the time traveler comes from. It's never like from a million years in the future. So by using this kind of excuse, we can explain that away. We can explain how come we don't have time travelers from a distant future and it's always just a few centuries, because maybe that's where the limit is, because if you jump more than 1,000 years into the future, you will suffer physical and biological problems, and so that's why no one does it. That's why it's always limited within a specific range. And so strangely, this excuse kind of fits what we saw in the other shows, and also in Star Trek Enterprise. They also had characters from about 1,000 years ahead, and they also seem to be pretty limited, strangely, to only sending holograms of themselves into the past or having to recruit people from the time period which they want to manipulate. They don't just send their own soldiers, but instead they recruit people from the time that they want to play with. Which I remember when I watched that show back then didn't really make any sense to me, and also how come if they are from a future far beyond the 24th century, in which it seemed to be pretty easy to jump all over time, you just have to slingshot around the sun or something, you can move through time no problems. So how come people from a more advanced future from centuries ahead suddenly have to send holograms or recruit people in the past? It didn't seem logical to me, but now with this excuse we can actually explain that. We can say that maybe future guy could have gone back in time himself or sent his own soldiers back in time, but he didn't want to, because then it will cause them damage and they will be limited to only a few jumps before they have to go back and stay in their own time. And so that explains why he had to recruit the Suliban to do his dirty work, and he only sent information and instructions to them using a hologram, and that way presumably he doesn't suffer any negative side effects. And speaking of side effects, we also heard that in an episode of Voyager about the starship relativity, which is also a time ship which can send people all over time, and for some reason they had to recruit 7 of 9 to do something on Voyager in the past. They couldn't send their own people, and they even told 7 of 9 that she will suffer all kinds of side effects if they jump her around in time too much. That she might suffer temporal psychosis, and if they do it more than 4 times, then she will die, even if they recruit her from before they recruited her originally. It will still affect her, which is kind of silly idea on the surface, because why would her previous body, before they did anything to her, already have those side effects if they recruit her from an earlier time? So it never really made much sense to me, but I guess with some temporal technobabble, we can say that by recruiting her from any point in her timeline, it will affect her molecules throughout the timeline of those molecules, and so it doesn't matter if they recruit her from previously, it will still produce the same side effects if they did it in the future or even in a different timeline. And technically it's a huge paradox they did in that episode. They basically said that Voyager exploded, and so they can recruit someone a microsecond before the explosion when they were still alive, and then use that person as a temporal soldier, and if that person dies again, they can recruit him again from simply an earlier point before that explosion. And so technically they could have been doing that infinitely and create an infinite copies of the same person, but the side effects still apply, so that's why they cannot do that. And the reason it's a paradox, because if they took her from the timeline already, if they take her again from a previous point, then they could not have taken her in the previous time. So that immediately creates a paradox of how did they did it previously. But because I presume their time ship also has temporal shields and stuff like that, so they can avoid the repercussions of changing their own timeline, what they did previously. And so if not for a limitation like those side effects, they could technically produce endless copies of the same person by simply recruiting him again and again each time from a previous point, and that way they can have a whole army of temporal agents doing whatever they want. They will have godlike powers basically. So adding a limitation doesn't let it be so easy, and so that's why I kind of like the idea of limitations, because otherwise the heroes will be overpowered. They will be like Q basically, that can do basically anything they want. So time travelers would be absolute gods if not for those kinds of limitations. And so they said in that episode that they can only recruit 7 of 9 for a very limited number of times before it becomes too dangerous and even lethal. So I presume the same limitation applies to the time agents we saw in Enterprise, and so maybe that's why Future Guy only sent a hologram of himself and didn't physically come back in time. I guess he probably came back in time originally when he first made contact with the Suliban, when he left that technology through which he can contact them later, so they had to have received it somehow, and they cannot receive that information without that pad, without that device that shows his hologram. And so I'm guessing he did travel back in time at least once physically, then went back to his own time, and since then he only sends instructions and information to his Suliban army, and that way he doesn't have to suffer as many negative side effects. It can be argued maybe that guy does suffer from temporal psychosis, maybe that's why he's evil, maybe he actually was a good guy once, maybe one of those same time agents as Daniels, maybe actually Daniels himself. That would have been my preferred theory, if it was an older Daniels who got temporal psychosis and got stuck in an earlier century. I think that would have been the best explanation for that unfinished plotline, which always annoyed me that they never revealed who it was. They never finished that story. And some of the writers of that show said that they planned for it to be Archer in the end, which would have been a nice twist, but not really believable. Can you really imagine Archer as an evil bad guy? I don't think so. And also, why would he be trying to kill his younger self, when he sent the Suliban to attack the Enterprise and all of that? It doesn't really make sense in my opinion, so I would not have wanted it to be Archer. Maybe someone else from the Enterprise crew would have made more sense, maybe Reed or someone like that, someone who was always kind of with a little bit of a dark side. But Archer, I can't really see him being that villain, and maybe Daniels or another time agent from the far future who went back and got stuck in an earlier century. So that would have been my solution. But anyway, I'm going off topic. So we can say that those time travelers we saw in Enterprise were limited because of that kind of side effect, and that can explain why Daniels always wanted to recruit Archer to do things in the 22nd century and even one time in the 21st century. And they said something about bureaucracy and regulations, that he needs more time to get the proper approval for missions, and so he secretly sent Archer on missions without the approval to save time, which doesn't really make sense since he's a time traveler. So maybe that's simply what he told Archer. Maybe he actually knew about the potential side effects and didn't want to concern Archer, because Archer wouldn't really suffer any such side effects if he only goes on short-range mission. There was that one time when he pulled him to his own century, to the 31st century, to hide him from the Suliban, and so that seems kind of risky, because a whole 1,000-year jump is supposedly lethal according to Star Trek Discovery, but I guess that's only if you go into a different timeline. And maybe it depends on the method of time travel. Maybe Daniels had a way to shield Archer for a one-time jump, and of course somehow that destroyed the whole future, because he pulled Archer from the present, from the 22nd century. It caused the Federation never to have formed and Earth to be destroyed, and Daniel somehow couldn't predict that, and his temporal shields didn't work for some reason, except on him himself, I guess, because he was still there in his uniform, and so I guess it did protect him personally when he did that time manipulation, when he pulled Archer to the future, but it destroyed everything else, including the time portals, and then later he managed to somehow send him back and to fix it. I'm guessing we can explain all of that event by saying because Archer disappeared from the present, it's as if he never existed, and so Daniels somehow didn't realize that's going to happen. I guess he was relying on his temporal shields a little bit too much, but Archer missing in the 22nd century was just too big of a change that even his temporal shields couldn't have withstood the massive change in the timeline as a result. So anyway, Archer didn't seem to suffer any negative side effects, but maybe it's because he quickly went back to his own time. And in other times we saw that he actually sends Archer back into his own body, so he only sends his own consciousness back to his own body just a year before in order to talk with him secretly without, I guess, any other time travelers knowing about it. So they seem to have the technology to transfer a consciousness of a person into his own body in a different time period, and maybe that way to avoid any physical side effects. And now that I think about it, if the series would have continued and would have done more stuff like that, maybe it could explain why Archer would eventually get temporal psychosis. Maybe with all this temporal manipulation and him jumping all over the place all the time, maybe that will drive him nuts and then he will turn into future guy. So maybe it would have been plausible if the series continued, and if they wrote it well, then they could have tied it all together in the end in a clever way. But it would still mean that Daniels was kind of guilty of it. And speaking of Daniels, how did he appear in the 22nd century? From the far future, he said in the episode Cold Front, he said that a future guy can only send a hologram of himself into the past, and then implied that he can go physically into the past, but his actual dialogue said that in the centuries to come they perfected that technology. And so I think we can interpret that dialogue to say that Daniels is actually a hologram in that episode, that he's sending a hologram of himself as well, but that hologram is far more advanced than Future's guy's hologram, in which you can barely see him and he has to stand in one spot. But maybe Daniels is also a hologram which is interactive, that can walk around and move around. And the biggest confirmation of this was in the end of that episode, when Silik shoots Daniels and apparently kills him. But if you look closely, Daniels doesn't seem like he's been vaporized. He seems as if he's a hologram which is being disrupted and disappears. And we also know that he comes back later multiple times and he's still alive, so he did not die in that incident. So we can say that he was either teleported away in the last minute, or that he was actually a hologram transmitted from the future into the past, and a fully interactive hologram. And we know that such technology existed even in the 21st century. There was an episode of Voyager in which a guy sent a hologram of himself to Voyager, and he could interact with everything. He could even taste the coffee. So that shows that you can send a hologram of yourself that is fully interactive in every way. So I'm guessing that's what Daniels was in that episode, that he was actually a hologram controlled from some kind of VR station in his own time, and he was just playing around in the past without risking any health side effects because he's not actually there. So that's, I think, the best excuse. And that explains why he was still alive later on. And the biggest evidence that time travel can give you health problems was in the episode Stormfront in the beginning of season 4, in which the timeline drastically changed back in the 20th century when the Nazis won the war, thanks to other time-traveling aliens which we didn't see before. They were said to be one of the factions of the temporal Cold War in the future, and they changed the history of Earth. And then we saw Daniels appearing, and he was all messed up. Parts of his body were very old, other parts were like a fetus, and he was all messed up. And so presumably, once again, his temporal shields didn't help him, and because of the temporal war which got hot in the future, he got all messed up. Maybe because of his previous time jumps, because he existed in so many different time periods that his body got confused because of that, and we didn't actually see the temporal war itself. So I'm guessing all kinds of crazy things could have happened. So that's why it kind of made sense what happened to him, and he never kind of vaporized like what started to happen with Georgiou, and so it's not exactly the same thing, but it's a similar idea of time traveling messing you up biologically, especially if the timeline changed, which did happen in that episode. So this is why what we heard in season 3 of Star Trek Discovery kind of makes sense, because it fits all of those other events I mentioned, and it explains why we don't really see time travelers from a much more distant future in all the other shows. It's always very close range, and so we can say it's because of this kind of limitation of all time machines. And I didn't really like the idea of season 3 of Discovery that said that they banned all time travel technology and that no one is doing time traveling anymore because of the temporal war, especially because in the other older shows we saw how often time travel can happen accidentally and how many space anomalies exist which can accidentally send ships to different time periods. And so how exactly can you ban something which occurs in nature? That you can accidentally encounter some kind of phenomenon that will send you back or forward in time accidentally. How can you ban that? And so you wouldn't really stop time traveling just saying it's banned now, it's illegal now, so don't time travel if it can happen by accident. So that part didn't really make much sense, unless if they should have said that they had some kind of technology to monitor all of that or even to actively prevent it. And that can explain why there are no more time traveling going on. So what they should have said is that they have some kind of temporal police, temporal agents, which keep an eye on the whole galaxy, and if someone attempts another incident of time travel, they will stop them immediately, which would beg the question, why didn't they find and stop the USS Discovery when it time traveled? Maybe they can say they only take notice if someone comes from the future, because it would be kind of ridiculous to say that you cannot travel from the past to the future, because it kind of happens naturally. Everybody are moving to the future, and what if someone just cryo freezes his whole ship and his whole crew and then get to the future that way? Will that also be illegal? And so when the Admiral had that line when he said the time traveling is illegal even from the past to the future, it didn't really make sense, because you don't even need time travel technology for that. You can simply freeze your whole crew, or you can park your ship very close to a black hole, and that way time will travel more slowly for the ship compared to the rest of the universe, and then when you leave that area, then suddenly you're in the far future from where you originated. And so there are a million ways to get to the future without actually time jumping to the future. So saying that's illegal is kind of ridiculous. So that was a bad line in Discovery when they said that Discovery is guilty of time traveling even though they came from the past. And so that was kind of stupid, but there were those incidents like in the episode Yesterday's Enterprise, when a time vortex opened up and brought a starship from the past into the future, and that starship disappearing in the past did change the whole timeline. So we can say that is the kind of violation he was talking about. If a starship disappears from the past, it might affect the future, obviously, and so maybe that's what he was referring to. Obviously, if someone opens a portal and takes someone from the past into the future, that will change the past, but I would argue that's more the fault of the party in the future which is creating that event. And so it's not the fault of someone in the past if he gets snatched into the future by some force from the future. And so how can the person from the past be a criminal if someone else snatched him into the future? And so maybe that's why they were not persecuted in Star Trek Discovery for coming to the future, because they didn't know about that rule yet. So I guess it wasn't a crime according to the galactic treaty which prevents time traveling, or maybe the Admiral lied about them and covered them up. Maybe that's why he refitted their ship and put an A on it to pretend as if it's a new ship from this time period, so that no one will know that it's a ship from the past. So none of this was properly explained in the show, and they also had this problem that Georgiou was having, because she's not just from the past like the rest of the crew, which didn't seem to have any side effects, but she's also from another universe. And that combined with the time jump made her molecular structure unstable, and she begins to kind of break apart, and she has limited time to live, and so that's why they had to send her closer to her origin point in the timeline through the Guardian of Forever, and possibly to a different timeline. I guess we'll wait and see what will happen with that character. I personally do not think that a Section 31 show is a good idea, so I kind of hope it will never happen. And I'm perfectly okay with never knowing what happened to her in the past, and so I guess they sent her back to roughly the same time that she left, and that way she could continue living. And back to this whole idea of molecules wanting to exist in the time they were created. First of all, I'm really glad they said the word molecules and not atoms, because all the atoms we are made from were actually made billions of years ago inside the cores of stars that went supernova and exploded, and so all our heavy elements were made inside supernovas, and all our atoms were made inside of stars, and maybe some of our hydrogen molecules were made even before that, maybe from the beginning of the universe. And so if he would have said that atoms want to go back to the time in which they were created, I would have facepalmed really hard, because then I would know the writers don't know that all the atoms we are made of were all created billions of years ago and not when we were born. And so that would have annoyed me a lot, but luckily he said molecules, and so we can say, okay, the molecular structure does change, and maybe all these particles have some kind of internal clock. We do know, even in Enterprise, it was said that you can actually scan something and know the time it came from using quantum dating, they said, and so we do know that particles have some kind of clock that you can measure, and we also heard, even back in TNG, that you can scan the quantum signature to know if something is from this universe or another universe, and so there are ways to detect all of that. And so I guess maybe if you take an item or a person from one universe to another, or from a distant timeline to another timeline, it can have some kind of negative effect on it. So maybe I can accept it, even though still I would say, most of our body is made from the water we drink. And so, Giorgio is mostly made of water from the same universe that she lived in for about a year by this time period. And so most of her body is made from current day stuff and not the original material from her own universe. So why is her entire body being vaporized and all of that? So it doesn't really make sense in real life, but in Star Trek there are a lot of strange stuff, which is kind of magical anyway. So I guess I can accept this idea because it kind of fits all the things I mentioned from previous shows and other episodes and other movies. And I also kind of like that they addressed the alternate timeline of the Kelvin movies in that episode when he showed the hologram of Yor, who was said to be a temporal agent who came from a different timeline that was created by a Romulan mining ship. So that's Nero's ship. So I kind of like the fact that they addressed that they said that they are aware of that other timeline. But what's curious about all of this is how exactly did that guy end up in this timeline if he came from the JJ 2009 timeline that was created by Nero's ship, and he's wearing an early TNG uniform, and so maybe that's the uniform of the reboot TNG that came a century after the 2009 movie. So how exactly did he end up back in the Prime timeline? I'm guessing with all the temporal wars they mentioned, maybe some of them were taking place in that other timeline as well, and somehow things got intermixed and mangled, and somehow he ended up in this timeline. And so because it's kind of a different universe and also a very big time jump, that's why he suffered this condition in which his body is breaking up and they couldn't save him anyway, because time travel was illegal by that point, so they couldn't send him back closer to his original point in time. And so he just died in the end. And so Giorgio was sent back using the Guardian of Forever, which is supposed to lead her character into the Section 31 show, which I made a whole video about my thoughts on that. And I think the best place for a Section 31 show would have been in the 22nd century during the time of the Earth-Romulan War. I think that's an interesting time period which we never got to see in the Star Trek timeline. And also, if Earth's very survival is on the line, that would kind of justify a heroes of a show to do all kinds of shady things in order to win that war. And so that would make it more justifiable for the heroes of the show to be involved in stuff like that and still be moral heroes. Just like in my opinion the stuff that Sisko did during the Dominion War was kind of justified because of the high stakes of the situation, because he was doing it not because he liked it or enjoyed it, but to save billions of people and prevent the whole quadrant from being conquered and enslaved. And so that kind of justifies all those evil actions he sometimes had to do as a necessary evil to prevent a bigger evil. And so that, I think, allows for a heroes of a show to do all those kinds of things and still be justified and still have us rooting for them because of the high stakes. And so that's why I think a Section 31 show might work if we set it in the Earth-Romulan War, which I don't think they will. They probably will set it during the Pike show, because that way they can reuse the same sets and uniforms and all of that and save themselves money. So that's probably what they will do. But anyway, I made a whole video about this topic a while ago, so I will link it in the end of this video. And as for the issue of time traveling, I will probably do a lot more videos about this, because this is a very convoluted and interesting topic to discuss. So more of this is coming. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comment section below. Make sure to subscribe, click the notification bell to see updates of new videos. Check out all the links in the description box, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.